My name is Emma Williams. I'm 33 years old, and 6 months ago I stood in a ballroom at the Cranmore Estate, in a pale green dress that hid almost nothing, listening to my own sister tell 200 people I was pregnant, before I had told a single soul in that room myself. She did it on purpose. She did it into a microphone, and she smiled the entire time she was doing it, the way you smile when you have practiced something in a mirror, until it feels like spontaneity. The tap of a fork against a champagne flute is a small, ordinary sound. It means a toast is coming, a joke about how the groom used to be a mess, maybe a story about how the couple met. Nobody in that room expected it to mean anything else. Vanessa stood up from the head table in her ivory gown, the one I had spent 4 months helping her choose, the one I had personally driven to 3 different seamstresses to get the beading right on the sleeves because she cried the first 2 times it wasn't perfect. She held that microphone like she had been waiting her whole life to hold it, and in a way, I think she had. I was seated at table 14, not the family table, not even close to the family table. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it tells you almost everything you need to know about my family before I say another word. Table 14 was tucked near the service hallway, close enough that I could hear the kitchen doors swinging every time a server pushed through with another tray of seared salmon I had personally negotiated the price of down to $11 a plate. My parents sat at table 1, glowing under the string lights, laughing with Vanessa's new in-laws like they had never once made me feel like an afterthought in my own family. I had a hand resting flat on my stomach under the tablecloth. 12 weeks. I was 12 weeks pregnant, and I had told exactly 3 people on the entire planet. My grandmother Ruth, before she passed in the spring. My business partner, Dana, who had covered for me during 2 rounds of early morning sickness at work without asking a single question I wasn't ready to answer. And my doctor, obviously, because doctors kind of have to know. I had not told my parents. I had not told Vanessa. I had certainly not told the 200 guests eating my carefully sourced salmon under a tent I had personally walked the caterer through, room by room 3 weeks earlier. Vanessa tapped the glass a second time, and the room quieted the way rooms do when they sense something is about to happen that they will want to remember. She thanked everyone for coming. She thanked our parents for footing half the flowers, which was a lie, because I had covered the florist myself after the original quote came in $11,000 over budget, and nobody else in this family seemed capable of picking up a phone and negotiating anything. She thanked her new husband, Derek, for choosing her, which was a strange way to phrase a marriage, but that was Vanessa. Everything in her world was about being chosen, being picked first, being the one worth picking. Then she turned, slow and deliberate, the way a spotlight turns, and she looked directly at table 14. Directly at me. "I want to say a family emergency," she said into the microphone, her voice pitched perfectly for a room this size, warm enough to sound loving, sharp enough underneath that I felt it land somewhere behind my ribs before she even finished the sentence. And I think, actually, this is the perfect moment to share some exciting news, because we're all here, and family should hear big news together, shouldn't they? I felt my whole body go still in the way it does, right before something breaks. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a kind of internal silence, the sound your own heartbeat makes when you are bracing for impact, and there is absolutely nothing left to do but wait for it to land. "My sister Emma," she said, and even the way she said my name carried a smirk in it, "is pregnant." The room did the thing rooms do. A ripple, a gasp, a few scattered claps from people who did not yet understand the tone underneath the announcement, who thought this was a gift being given, rather than a weapon being aimed. My mother's hand flew to her chest at table 1, and I could not tell in that first half-second if it was joy or horror, because with my mother those 2 things have always looked remarkably similar when they are aimed at me. "And get this," Vanessa continued, riding the momentum now, feeding off the attention the way she always has, feeding off it the way some people breathe oxygen. "She's not even seeing anyone. No boyfriend, no fiancé, nobody standing up here with her tonight to celebrate. She's just She paused for effect, doing it alone. Isn't that brave? The word brave came out of her mouth, sounding exactly like the opposite of what it was supposed to mean. A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the tables closest to the front, the kind of laughter people make when they don't know if it's socially acceptable to be horrified yet. My father's jaw did the thing it does when he is choosing, once again, not to intervene. My mother's mouth had gone into a thin, tight line I had seen 1,000 times before, the line that meant she was already rehearsing how she would explain this to her book club, without sounding like the villain in her own daughter's story. I sat at table 14 in my pale green dress, 12 weeks pregnant, with a room full of strangers and half-strangers turning in their chairs to look at me, to measure me, to decide in real time whether I deserved pity or judgment. I could feel Dana's hand find mine under the table, steady and warm, the only steady thing in that entire ballroom. And I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened in the next 90 seconds, because it matters more than anything else in this story. I did not stand up. I did not cry. I did not storm the head table and grab that microphone out of my sister's hand, though God knows some part of me wanted to. I let her finish. I let her stand there under those string lights in the dress I helped pay for, in the venue I helped negotiate, in front of guests eating food I had sourced and priced and confirmed down to the last catering invoice, and I let her say every single cruel, calculated word she had clearly been saving up for weeks. Because I already knew something Vanessa did not know that night. I knew exactly how much of this wedding actually belonged to me on paper. I knew whose name was on the vendor contracts. I knew who the caterer, the florist, and the venue coordinator would be calling first thing Monday morning if a single check bounced. And sitting there in that folding chair by the kitchen doors, feeling my daughter kick for the very first time under my ribs, at the exact moment my sister called me brave, in the cruelest voice I have ever heard a human being use, I made a decision that would end that wedding season for good. And it would not be me who ended it loudly. It would be the paperwork. If you have ever sat in a room and watched someone you love use your most private moment as a punchline, you already know the particular kind of quiet that settles over you right before you decide to fight back. Drop where you're watching from in the comments and stay with me, because what I did after Vanessa finally lowered that microphone is the part of this story nobody at that wedding saw coming. Subscribe so you don't miss it. To understand why I sat so still while my sister humiliated me in front of 200 people, you have to go back almost 30 years, to a house in Millbrook, Connecticut, where the math never once added up in my favor. I was the older daughter by 2 years, and for most of my childhood I thought that meant something. It did not. Vanessa arrived loud and easy to love in a way I never quite managed to be, and somewhere in the first few years of her life, my parents made a quiet, unspoken decision about which daughter was going to be the star of this family and which daughter was going to be the one who made sure the lights stayed on. I was 8 years old the first time I understood the shape of it, though I would not have had the words for it back then. It was a Tuesday in October, and I had come home from school with a certificate for the regional spelling bee, pinned proudly to my backpack. The kind of thing an 8-year-old carries like a trophy, checking it every few minutes on the bus ride home, just to make sure it was still real. I burst through the front door ready to show my mother, and I found her in the kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear, already mid-conversation with my Aunt Carol, already talking about Vanessa's dance recital that weekend, the costume that needed hemming, the solo Vanessa had somehow landed even though she was only 6. I stood in that kitchen doorway holding my certificate for a full minute before my mother even noticed I was there, and when she finally did, she smiled the kind of smile you give a stranger's child and said, "That's nice, sweetheart," before turning right back to the phone. That was the pattern for the next 15 years. Vanessa's recitals got new dresses. My recitals, when I had them, got whatever was already hanging in my closet. Vanessa's report cards got taped to the refrigerator, where every guest who walked through our kitchen would see them. Mine got a nod and a comment about how I was such a hard worker, said in a tone that somehow made hard worker sound like a consolation prize for a child who was never going to be naturally gifted at anything worth bragging about. I want to be clear that nobody in my family was ever outright cruel to me the way you see in movies. Nobody screamed, nobody locked me in a closet. It was quieter than that, and quieter cruelty is somehow harder to name and harder to escape, because you spend years wondering if you are simply imagining the whole thing. By the time I was in high school, I had already figured out the unofficial family job description that had been handed to me without anyone ever actually asking if I wanted it. I was the fixer. I was the one who remembered when the car registration was due, who called to reschedule my mother's dentist appointments when she forgot, who sat with Vanessa at the kitchen table for hours, helping her cram for exams she would have otherwise failed, because somewhere along the way, it became my responsibility to make sure Vanessa never had to face the consequences of anything. When Vanessa wrecked her first car at 19, 3 months after getting it as a graduation gift, I was the one who spent a weekend calling insurance adjusters and rental car companies so my parents wouldn't have to deal with the headache, while Vanessa sat on the couch scrolling her phone, mildly inconvenienced that she'd have to borrow my car for a few days. I built my career the same way I built everything else in my life, quietly and without asking permission from anyone. I studied hospitality management in college, worked event coordination jobs through my 20s, learned every ugly, unglamorous truth about contracts and vendor negotiations, and how to read the fine print on a catering invoice so nobody could ever quietly overcharge me by $3,000 and call it a service fee. By 28, I had started my own event planning company with Dana, the two of us running it out of a converted garage for the first 18 months, building it dollar by dollar the same way I had built every ounce of self-sufficiency I had ever needed in that family. By the time Vanessa got engaged to Derek, Williams & Cho Events was a real business with a real reputation in 3 counties, and I had planned weddings for people whose names you would recognize if I told you, though I never would, because discretion is half of what people pay us for. So when Vanessa called me 11 months before her wedding, crying on the phone about how overwhelmed she felt, how she and Derek couldn't possibly afford the venue they wanted, how she just needed her big sister to help her the way I always helped everyone, I did what I have always done. I said yes. I did not even hesitate, and looking back now, I think that is the part that still stings the most. Not the humiliation at the reception itself, but the fact that I said yes so fast, so automatically, like some part of me was still that 8-year-old standing in the kitchen doorway with a certificate nobody wanted to look at, still hoping that this time, if I just did enough, gave enough, fixed enough, it might finally be my turn to be the one who got chosen. My parents were thrilled, of course, in the specific way they are always thrilled when I quietly solve a problem so they don't have to. My father clapped me on the shoulder at Thanksgiving that year and said, "That's my girl, always taking care of things," and I remember sitting there at that table, 28 years into this particular assignment, and thinking that I had never once in my life heard him say, "That's my girl," about anything I had actually done for myself. It was always about what I had done for someone else. My worth in that family had never been measured by my own accomplishments. It had been measured entirely by how useful I made myself to everyone around me, and I had absorbed that lesson so completely that by the time I was helping negotiate Vanessa's venue contract down by $9,000, I did not even register it as strange that I was doing this for free, on top of running my own company, on top of my own life, because that had simply always been the price of my seat at this family's table. I want you to hold on to that image, because it matters for everything that comes after it. Table 14, tucked by the kitchen doors, was not an accident on my sister's wedding day. It was the natural conclusion of 30 years of seating charts I had never gotten to draw myself. I got pregnant the way a lot of women my age get pregnant, when they have stopped waiting for permission to build the life they actually want. I was 32, unmarried, and I had spent the better part of a decade watching every relationship I tried to build quietly collapse under the weight of always being the one who gave more, who scheduled more, who remembered more, who showed up more, until eventually I was too tired to keep pouring myself into men who treated me the same way my family always had. So somewhere around my 32nd birthday, sitting in Dana's apartment with a glass of wine, I wasn't drinking because some quiet, hopeful part of me was already planning for this. I told her I had been thinking about doing it alone. A donor. A clinic 3 towns over that had a good reputation and a discreet waiting room. Dana did not blink. She just asked when I wanted to start looking at donor profiles, and that was the whole conversation, because that is what real support actually sounds like. No drama, no lecture, just someone sitting beside you saying, "Okay, let's figure this out together." I chose the process carefully, the way I choose everything, which is to say I researched it for 4 months before I ever set foot in the clinic. I picked a donor with a family medical history as clean as I could find, a man whose profile mentioned he had been a hospice volunteer in college, which felt like a strange, small thing to fall in love with. But I did. I went through 2 rounds that did not take before the 3rd one finally did, and I remember sitting in my car in the clinic parking lot after the confirmation call, both hands gripping the steering wheel, laughing and crying at the same time, in that particular way that only happens when something you have wanted for a long time finally, actually happens. The first person I told was my grandmother Ruth. She was 84 that spring, living in an assisted living community, about 40 minutes outside the city, and I had been driving out to see her every other Sunday for years, long after most of the rest of the family had reduced their visits to holidays and the occasional obligatory phone call. Ruth was the only person in my entire extended family who had ever made me feel like being useful and being loved were 2 separate things, and that I was allowed to have both without earning either one. I told her on a Sunday in March, sitting beside her bed with the window open, just enough to let in the smell of the courtyard garden she loved, and she reached over with a hand that had gotten so thin and papery in those last months, and gripped mine harder than I thought she still had strength for, and she said, "Emma, honey, you have spent your whole life making sure everybody else's cup was full. It is about time you filled your own." She passed 6 weeks later, quietly, in her sleep, and I have thought about that sentence almost every single day since. I told Dana next, obviously, because Dana had already been carrying half the weight of my life for years without ever asking for credit. And I told my doctor because that part is simply logistics. I did not tell my parents. I did not tell Vanessa. And I want to be honest about why. Because it is not a simple answer. Part of it was timing. Vanessa's wedding was 6 months out when I found out I was pregnant, and I absolutely knew, that if I announced my pregnancy before her wedding, my family would find some way to make it about her losing attention, about me stealing her moment, about how selfish it was of me to bring something so big into a season that was supposed to be entirely hers. I had watched this exact dynamic play out for 30 years. When I got my first big promotion at the hotel group I worked for, before starting my own company, my mother mentioned it once at dinner, and then spent the rest of the meal talking about how Vanessa's boyfriend at the time had just gotten his real estate license. When I bought my first condo at 29, entirely on my own, with money I had saved dollar by dollar for 6 years, my father's first comment was that it was smaller than Vanessa's apartment, which Derek was still paying for at the time. I had learned, through decades of quiet, repeated evidence, that any good news of mine was treated as a competitive threat to whatever good news Vanessa happened to be having at the same moment, and I simply did not have the emotional bandwidth to walk into that particular storm while also trying to help plan her wedding and process the loss of my grandmother in the same 6-month window. The other part of it, the part I am less proud of admitting, is that I was scared, not of the pregnancy itself. I had wanted this for a long time, and I had made peace with doing it alone before I ever walked into that clinic. I was scared of the specific way my family would talk about it, the specific tone Vanessa would use, the specific look my mother gets on her face when she is deciding how a piece of news reflects on her socially, before she has even asked how it makes me feel. I wanted to protect this pregnancy, this quiet, private, hard-won thing, for as long as I possibly could, from the version of my family that turns everything into a performance for an audience. I made it to 12 weeks without telling a single member of my immediate family, and I genuinely believed, right up until the moment Vanessa tapped that champagne glass, that I was going to be the one who got to decide how and when this news reached them. I found out later, from Dana, who heard it secondhand from a bridesmaid, exactly how Vanessa had figured it out. I had left my phone unlocked on the kitchen counter during a dress-fitting appointment 3 weeks before the wedding, and Vanessa, waiting for me to come out of the fitting room, had picked it up to check the time and seen a notification from my prenatal vitamin app sitting right there on the lock screen. She never said a word to me about it. She never asked a single question. She simply tucked that piece of information away, like a card she was saving for exactly the right moment to play, and she waited, patiently, silently, for 6 weeks, until she had a microphone in her hand and 200 witnesses in the room, before she decided to play it. That is the version of my sister most people never got to see. The version who could smile at you across a dress fitting for 20 straight minutes, while sitting on a secret that would humiliate you in front of your entire family, and never once let it show on her face. I had spent 30 years believing Vanessa's cruelty was mostly accidental, mostly the byproduct of a family that had trained her to expect the spotlight, and trained me to hand it to her. Standing at table 14 that night, I understood for the first time that some of it had never been accidental at all. When Vanessa first called me crying about the wedding budget, 11 months out, I made a decision that I want to walk you through carefully, because it is the decision that made everything else possible later. I did not simply offer to help for free the way I had helped with every single crisis in this family since I was 8 years old. This time, because I run a business, because contracts are the language I speak fluently, I told Vanessa that Williams & Cho Events would handle the vendor coordination, and that meant everything would go through me on paper. Every contract, every deposit, every negotiated rate, every single agreement with the venue, the caterer, the florist, and the photographer would list Williams & Cho Events as the point of contact, and, in several cases, as the party financially responsible for the deposit and final balance, with Vanessa and Derek reimbursing me on an agreed schedule. At the time, I framed this to myself as good business practice, because it was. I had learned the hard way, years earlier, coordinating a friend's wedding as a favor before I had my own company, that family and friends who do not have skin in the contract game will change their minds 3 times, blow through deadlines, and leave you holding an invoice nobody wants to claim responsibility for. So when Vanessa and Derek sat down with me at my kitchen table that first weekend, laptop open, spreadsheets ready, I explained it plainly. I would use my industry relationships to get them better rates than they could get on their own. I would manage every vendor conversation so they did not have to deal with the stress of it. And because Cranmore Estate, the venue they wanted, required a corporate or established business account to even hold the date on such short notice for peak wedding season, the booking itself would technically sit under my company's name, with a signed side agreement transferring full payment responsibility to Vanessa and Derek. They signed it without reading more than the first page. I remember that specifically, because I remember thinking, even then, some quiet part of me noting it, the way you notice a crack in a foundation you are not yet worried about, that Vanessa signed her name on that agreement, the same way she had signed permission slips and car insurance forms our whole lives, glancing at it, trusting that I had already handled the part that mattered. After all, handling things was what I did. Over the next several months, I negotiated the Cranmore Estate rental down by $9,000 by agreeing to book it during a slower Sunday slot instead of the Saturday they originally wanted. A trade Vanessa was furious about for exactly 4 days before she decided the savings meant she could afford a better band. I got the caterer, a man named Victor I had worked with a dozen times before, to knock the per-plate cost down to $11 by committing to a set menu instead of the custom tasting menu Vanessa initially wanted. I found a florist willing to work under budget by pulling favors from 2 previous clients who owed me nothing but goodwill. Every single deposit that went out over those 11 months went out from an account tied to my business, with the understanding, in writing, that Vanessa and Derek would reimburse each payment within 30 days of it clearing. They did not always do that. I want to be honest about that part, because it matters. The florist deposit went unreimbursed for almost 2 months before I gently followed up and Vanessa waved it off as an oversight, blaming Derek's schedule at the accounting firm where he worked, saying they would catch up on it soon. The photographer's second payment sat unpaid for 6 weeks. By the time the wedding actually arrived, there was a balance of just over $4,000 still outstanding across 3 different vendors, all of it technically owed to me, all of it sitting on my books, as an accounts receivable I had not yet had to think too hard about collecting, because I had never in my life sent an invoice to my own sister, and I genuinely was not sure I ever would. The small cruelties started around the time the dress fittings began, right around when Vanessa found my prenatal app, though I did not know that yet. She started making comments, small ones at first, the kind that are easy to explain away individually, and impossible to ignore once you stack enough of them together. At the dress fitting where I believe she saw my phone, she looked at my reflection in the mirror, while the seamstress was pinning her sleeve and said, "You should really think about doing something with your hair before the wedding, Emma. You've looked tired lately." At the seating chart meeting 3 weeks before the wedding, she informed me, almost offhand, that she had put me at a back table because she wanted her college friends closer to the dance floor and figured I would understand, since I always understood. Since understanding was, again, what I did. The seating chart is the part I want you to remember most clearly, because it is the same story my entire childhood was built on, just wearing a different dress. I had spent 11 months making sure this wedding actually happened on budget, on schedule, with vendors who respected the timeline, because they respected me. I had personally driven to 3 seamstresses. I had personally called Victor twice a week in the final month to confirm the menu changes Vanessa kept making. And when the final seating chart came across my inbox, I found my own name tucked at table 14, beside the kitchen doors, 3 tables further back than my parents' second cousins, further back than Derek's college roommates plus 1, further back than almost anyone in that entire room. I did not say anything about it. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters for understanding what happened later. I looked at that seating chart for a long time on a Tuesday night, alone in my apartment, one hand resting on the small, still barely there curve of my stomach, and I felt something settle in me that was not quite anger yet, something quieter and colder than that, something closer to clarity. I did not confront Vanessa. I did not ask my parents to intervene. I simply closed the laptop, and I made one phone call, to my accountant, and I asked her to pull together a clean, itemized summary of every outstanding balance still owed to Williams and Cho events, across all 3 vendors, current as of that week, formatted the way I would format it for any other client. I told myself it was just good practice, keeping my books tidy before a busy season. I did not fully admit to myself, not yet, what I was actually preparing for. But some part of me, the part that had spent 30 years learning exactly how this family worked, already knew that a wedding built on unpaid balances and a seating chart that put me by the kitchen doors was not going to end quietly, and I intended to be ready for whatever came next. The wedding day itself started almost unbearably beautiful, and I remember being angry at the weather for that. Angry that the sky over Cranmore Estate was the exact soft gold color Vanessa had pinned to her inspiration board 11 months earlier. Angry that the flowers I had negotiated down to a reasonable price looked even better in person than they had in the mock-ups. Angry that some traitorous part of me still felt a flicker of pride watching all of it come together exactly the way I had planned it, even knowing where I had been seated. I arrived early, the way I always do, walking the grounds with Victor's kitchen team, confirming the timeline with the coordinator, checking that the string lights over the tent had been hung the way I specified, and not the cheaper way the electrician had tried to talk us into during setup. I did all of this in a pale green dress with my hair done and a smile on my face, because that is also what I do, and because some habits take longer to unlearn than a single humiliating night can teach you. The ceremony itself passed the way ceremonies do, fast and blurry. Vanessa radiant in the gown I had spent 4 months and 3 seamstresses helping her perfect. Derek looking genuinely happy, in a way that made me hope, foolishly, that maybe this whole day would simply be fine, that maybe I was bracing for something that was never actually going to come. My parents cried in the front row. My father walked Vanessa down the aisle with his chest puffed out, the exact way it had never once puffed out for anything I had done in 33 years, and I sat in the 4th row, not the 2nd, watching my little sister marry a man who seemed decent enough, and I told myself, quietly, that I was proud of her. And mostly, I was. Dinner service began around 6, and I want you to picture it, because the geography of that room matters. Table 1 sat directly in front of the small raised stage where the band would eventually play, close enough to catch every warm draft from the space heaters positioned near the dance floor. My parents sat there with Derek's parents, laughing, glowing, exactly where they belonged in the unspoken hierarchy of this family. Table 14 sat against the far wall, close enough to the kitchen doors that I felt the temperature shift every time a server pushed through them, close enough that I could hear pans clattering under the music during the quieter songs. Dana sat beside me, along with 2 of my former college roommates and a scattering of Derek's coworkers I had never met, all of us politely making conversation while eating a very good seared salmon that I had personally negotiated down to $11 a plate, a fact none of them would ever know or care about. The toasts began around 7:30. Derek's best man went first, a rambling, sweet story about their college fraternity days that got genuine laughs from the room. Vanessa's maid of honor, her college roommate Kelsey, went next, tearing up in a way that seemed real, talking about how Vanessa had always been the friend who lit up every room she walked into. And then Vanessa stood up herself, which was not on the timeline I had personally built and confirmed with the coordinator that morning, and she reached for the microphone with a confidence that told me, even before she said a single word, that this had been planned. "I want to say a family emergency," she began, and I felt Dana's whole body go tense beside me before I did, because Dana had heard enough stories about my family over the years to recognize the specific shape of an opening line like that. I think, actually, this is the perfect moment to share some exciting news, because we're all here, and family should hear big news together, shouldn't they? I have relived the next 90 seconds of my life more times than I can count, and I still cannot fully explain the strange, floating stillness that came over me while it was happening, the way you go quiet inside right before a car accident, aware of everything and somehow outside of it at the same time. "My sister Emma is pregnant," she announced, her voice pitched to carry to the very back of a tent that seated 200 people, and the room did exactly what rooms do. A ripple of gasps, a scattering of premature, confused applause from guests who had no idea yet what tone this news was being delivered in. "And get this," she continued, riding it, feeding on it. "She's not even seeing anyone. No boyfriend, no fiancé, nobody standing up here with her tonight to celebrate. She's just doing it alone. Isn't that brave?" I watched my mother's hand fly to her chest. I watched my father's jaw tighten in the exact way it tightens when he is choosing, once again, to say nothing at all. I watched Vanessa's eyes find mine across that room, bright and satisfied, drinking in every second of my exposure, the way some people drink in applause, and I understood in that moment that this had never been an accident, that she had been sitting on this information for weeks, waiting, patient as a spider, for the exact moment it would land hardest, and land in front of the largest possible audience. I felt Dana's hand find mine under the tablecloth, steady, grounding, the only solid thing in a room that had suddenly tilted sideways around me. And I want you to understand what I felt in that stretched, endless silence while 200 people turned in their chairs to look at me, because it was not what you might expect. It was not humiliation, not exactly, though there was plenty of that mixed in. It was something closer to recognition, a cold, clear click of understanding, settling into place, the same feeling I imagine you get right before you finally see a puzzle for what it actually is, instead of the picture you have spent your whole life hoping it would turn into. My sister had just handed me, in front of 200 witnesses, undeniable, public proof of exactly who she was and exactly how far she was willing to go, and some part of me, the part that had spent 11 months quietly keeping every contract, every deposit, every unpaid balance neatly organized in my own name, understood immediately that I finally had everything I needed to answer her. I let her finish. I want you to sit with that choice for a second, because it was the most deliberate thing I did that entire night. Vanessa stood at that microphone for another full 30 seconds after her big line landed, soaking in the murmurs, the whispers, the pity glances shot in my direction from tables full of people who did not know me well enough to know that pity was the last thing I needed from any of them. She laughed a little, a soft, self-satisfied laugh, and said something about how she just could not keep a secret from her favorite people, how she hoped I would forgive her for stealing a tiny bit of the spotlight tonight. And then, finally, she lowered the microphone and sat back down beside Derek, who looked at her with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between confusion and discomfort, like even he was not entirely sure what had just happened or why. I stood up from table 14 slowly, smoothing the front of my pale green dress, and I walked toward the head table without hurrying, because hurrying is what people do when they are panicking, and I was not panicking. I was, for the first time in longer than I could remember, completely calm. The room quieted again as I moved through it, guests turning to watch, probably expecting tears, expecting a scene, expecting the humiliated sister to either flee the tent or dissolve into the kind of emotional breakdown that would give this wedding a story people would gossip about for years. I gave them neither. I reached the head table and I asked Vanessa, gently, in a voice pitched just loud enough for the microphone still resting near her plate to pick up, if I could borrow it for a moment, since she had already opened the floor to family news. She hesitated, just for a second, something flickering behind her eyes that I recognized as the first small crack of realizing this might not be going exactly the way she had scripted it in her head. But 200 guests were watching, and refusing me the microphone in that moment would have looked exactly as petty and cruel as everything else she had done that night, so she handed it over with a smile that did not reach her eyes. I thanked everyone for being here to celebrate Vanessa and Derek, and I meant it, because whatever else was true, I had spent 11 months making sure this day happened, and some stubborn part of me still wanted it to be beautiful for them. Then I said that since my sister had decided tonight was the night for big family news, I actually had a small piece of my own to share, related to the wedding itself, and I thought the room deserved a little transparency, given how generously everyone had already been fed and entertained on Williams and Cho events tonight. I watched my father's face shift first, a flicker of confusion, because he did not fully understand yet what my company's name had to do with anything. I explained it plainly, the way I explain contracts to nervous clients every week of my professional life, calm and clear and entirely without malice in my tone, even though every word was a door quietly closing. I explained that Cranmore Estate, the caterer, the florist, and the photographer had all been booked, contracted, and paid through my company, because the venue required an established business account to hold this date, and because Vanessa and Derek had asked me, personally, to manage the vendor relationships so they would not have to deal with the stress of it themselves. I explained that this was an arrangement I had been genuinely happy to help with, because that is what family does for each other. And then I said that as of this morning, there remained an outstanding balance of just over $4,000 owed to 3 of those vendors, all of it currently sitting on my company's books, all of it, until this exact moment, something I had simply absorbed quietly, rather than make an issue of it during such a busy, stressful planning season. The room had gone very still. My mother's face had drained of color. I could see Derek doing quiet math in his head, the accountant in him clearly recognizing exactly what kind of sentence this was turning into, before anyone else fully caught up. I said that I was mentioning it now, publicly, not to embarrass anyone, but because I had just been publicly and rather thoroughly reminded, in front of the same 200 people, of exactly how much I mean to this family, and I thought it seemed like an appropriate moment for equally public transparency about exactly how much of tonight actually belonged to me on paper. I set the microphone down gently on the head table, the way you set something down when you are finished with it and have no interest in dragging the moment out longer than it needs to last. I did not call Vanessa cruel. I did not raise my voice a single time. I simply turned and walked back toward table 14, one hand resting lightly on my stomach, while behind me, the entire room dissolved into the kind of low, urgent murmuring that happens when 200 people simultaneously realize they have just watched something far more complicated than a happy accident unfold in front of them. Dana met me halfway across the room and wrapped an arm around my shoulders, and I could feel her shaking slightly with the effort of not laughing, not out of cruelty, but out of the particular kind of disbelief that comes from watching someone you love, finally, quietly, completely refuse to disappear. Behind us, I heard my mother's voice rising, sharp and panicked, asking Vanessa in a fierce whisper what exactly she meant by unpaid. And I heard Derek, in a low, tight voice I had never heard him use before, asking his new wife why there was $4,000 of debt attached to their wedding that he was only just now hearing about for the first time, in front of every single person either of them had ever wanted to impress. The reception did not end that night the way anyone had planned it, though I want to be clear, I never intended to blow it up entirely. I had simply stated facts, calmly, once, into a microphone my sister had handed me herself, and facts, once they are out in a room full of witnesses, have a way of moving on their own momentum without any further help from the person who spoke them. I did not go looking for Vanessa for the rest of the night. I did not need to. The damage, if you want to call it that, was not something I inflicted so much as something I simply stopped absorbing on everyone else's behalf. And the difference between those two things turned out to matter enormously in the weeks that followed. Derek found me near the gift table about 20 minutes after I sat back down, his tie loosened, his face pale in a way that told me he had already had at least one very tense conversation with his brand new wife. He apologized to me directly, sincerely, in a way that surprised me, because Derek and I had never been especially close, and he had no real obligation to take my side in a family conflict he had only married into that afternoon. He said he had no idea about any of it, the seating chart, the unpaid balances, any of it, and that he intended to get to the bottom of exactly where that $4,000 had gone, because as far as he understood, they had budgeted for every vendor payment months ago. I told him gently that I appreciated it, and that the money had never actually been the point for me, though I suspect neither of us fully believed that in the moment. The following Monday, I sent a formal, itemized invoice to Vanessa and Derek's shared email address, the same format I would send to any other client. Polite, professional, entirely without commentary, listing the 3 outstanding balances with their original due dates and the current amount owed. I did not send a single personal message alongside it. I did not need to, because the invoice itself said everything that needed saying. Derek paid the full balance within 3 days, transferring the money directly from an account I later learned Vanessa had not even known he had, a small, private savings account he had kept separate from their joint finances, specifically because, as he told me months later over coffee, he had started to suspect even before the wedding that Vanessa handled money the same careless way she handled people, spending first and figuring out the consequences later, usually by letting someone else absorb them. My parents called me the day after the wedding, and I want to describe that call carefully because it tells you everything about how this family actually processes accountability. My mother did not ask how I was feeling. She did not ask about the baby, not once, not in that entire conversation. She asked, in a tight, controlled voice, why I would humiliate my sister at her own wedding, why I could not have simply pulled her aside privately if there was a problem with the vendor payments, why family business needed to become a public spectacle in front of 200 guests. I let her finish, the same way I had let Vanessa finish, and then I asked her a single question in return. I asked her where that same concern for keeping family business private had been 3 minutes earlier, when Vanessa stood up with a microphone and announced my pregnancy, my medical history, and my relationship status to that same room of 200 guests without asking me a single thing first. My mother did not have an answer for that. She simply said that it was different, that Vanessa's news was happy news meant to celebrate me, and I told her, as calmly as I have ever said anything in my life, that if she genuinely believed that was true, then there was nothing left for the two of us to discuss that night, and I hung up the phone. Vanessa did not speak to me for almost 2 months after the wedding. When she finally did, it was a text message, not a call, 3 lines long, apologizing in the vague, deflecting way that people apologize when they are more sorry about consequences than they are about the actual harm they caused. She said she felt like I had embarrassed her in front of Derek's entire family. She did not mention the pregnancy announcement at all in that message, not once, as though it had simply evaporated from her memory the moment it stopped being useful to her. I did not respond right away. I let 2 full weeks pass, the same way I let her finish her toast, because I had learned something important that night at Cranmore Estate about the value of not rushing to fill silence with reassurance. When I finally did write back, I told her plainly that I loved her, that I always had, but that I was done being the sister who absorbed the cost of things so she never had to, financially or otherwise, and that if she wanted a relationship with me going forward, and with the daughter I was going to raise, it would need to look different than the one we had grown up with, the one where I planned every celebration and got seated at the table by the kitchen doors. She did not respond to that message for almost a month. When she finally called, in early autumn, her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it, and she told me, haltingly, that Derek had asked her some hard questions about that night, about the seating chart, about the unpaid balances, about why she had needed to say what she said in front of everyone. She said she had spent weeks defensive about it, before she finally sat with the actual question underneath his questions, which was simply why. Why she had needed the room's attention that badly. Why watching me succeed quietly, on my own terms, in my own time, had felt to her like something to punish rather than something to celebrate. I do not know if she has fully answered that question for herself yet, even now, but it was, as far as I know, the first time in either of our lives that Vanessa had ever admitted, out loud, to anyone, that the shape of our whole family might have been built wrong from the very beginning. My daughter was born on a Tuesday in late February, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair, and a scream that the nurses said was the loudest they had heard on the floor all week, which felt about right for a baby who had already survived being the subject of the most dramatic dinner announcement I have ever witnessed. I named her Ruth, after my grandmother, and I held her for the first time in a quiet hospital room that had exactly the right number of people in it, which is to say the people who actually wanted to be there. Dana came within the hour, still in her work clothes, crying before she even reached the door. My 2 college roommates from table 14 sent flowers the very next morning. My father came alone, without my mother, and sat beside my hospital bed for almost 2 hours, mostly in silence, and at one point, watching me feed Ruth in the pale morning light, he said quietly that he was sorry it had taken him this long to notice which daughter had actually been doing the work of holding this family together, and that he did not have a good excuse for it, only regret. My mother did not come to the hospital. She sent a card 2 weeks later, a generic one from the pharmacy rack. "Congratulations on your new arrival," printed in gold script above a stiff, careful note that never once used the word sorry. I keep it in a drawer, not because I treasure it, but because I think it is important, sometimes, to keep the evidence of exactly where people actually stood when it mattered. The same way I once kept every vendor contract organized in a folder nobody thought to ask about until the night they needed it most. Vanessa and I are still rebuilding something, slowly, carefully, on terms that look nothing like the ones we grew up with. She has come to visit Ruth 4 times now, always calling ahead, always asking if it is a good time, a small courtesy that would have seemed unremarkable in any other family, and felt, in ours, almost revolutionary. She held Ruth for the first time in my living room in March, and I watched her face while she did it, and for just a moment, I saw something in her that looked less like the woman who grabbed a microphone to humiliate her sister, and more like the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during car rides when we were young, before either of us had learned the roles this family had assigned us. I do not know yet what kind of aunt she will become. I know that I am watching, and I know that I am no longer willing to absorb the cost of finding out the hard way. Williams and Cho events had our best year on record the following spring, in part, I suspect, because the story of that wedding made its way through the local event industry in the peculiar, whispered way these things do, and more than one bride called our office, specifically asking for the planner who apparently does not let anyone push her around. I never confirmed or denied the rumor. I simply took the calls, booked the consultations, and kept building the thing I had built with my own 2 hands, long before anyone in my family ever thought to ask what I actually wanted for myself. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house once you stop waiting for people to seat you at their table the way you deserve, and start building a table of your own instead. Mine has a high chair at it now, and a grandmother's name stitched onto a small quilt folded over the back of the good armchair, and a seating chart that I get to draw myself for the first time in 33 years, filled with people who show up because they want to, not because someone assigned them a place near the exit and called it generosity. I think about that ballroom sometimes, the pale gold light, the string lights I fought for, the microphone Vanessa held like a weapon and I eventually held like a closing statement. I think about table 14, tucked by the kitchen doors, and I understand now that my sister thought she was putting me in the back of the room that night. What she actually did was hand me, in front of 200 witnesses, undeniable proof of exactly who was really running the show, and I have never once regretted letting her finish her sentence before I picked up the microphone myself. If you have ever sat quietly through your own humiliation while holding the one piece of leverage that would flip the entire room, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what you did when it was finally your turn to speak, and if this story reminded you that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one holding every contract, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Subscribe to The Dramatic Story, because the next family thinks they have gotten away with it too, and I promise you, they have not.